Since I was a child, it's always been a dream of mine to have my own house. Unfortunately, it seems like the older I get, the more unrealistic that dream becomes. At 18, a house was $200,000. By 28, houses in my area are upwards of $800,000. So now I'm taking the problem into my own hands, making my very own one-of-a-kind tiny house on wheels. In this video, I learn every step of the way with almost no prior experience. To build a home with no mortgage payment, no contractor, and no fixed location. So this tiny house build starts off with a good solid foundation, which in my case is this 11 by 30 foot tiny home trailer. I got this trailer specifically made to build a tiny home on wheels, and it has 3 7,000-pound axles and weighs about 3,000 pounds itself, which gives me 18,000 pounds to build my tiny home. So first step of this build is to insulate the floor. I have some of this rigid foam insulation that I'm cutting up with a circular saw and a rip jig. I was making sure to cut these pretty snug so that I could mallet them into place between the framing of the trailer, and then I'd use some expanding foam between layers to bond them together and seal in any air gaps. The middle portion of the trailer had this lowered framing, so I had to cut up some 2x4s to width and then screw this on top of the steel to raise the floor frame all to the same height. Before I got too far, I also had to add in the drainage pipes for my sinks and shower. And I just ran these all to one point where it comes out the floor of the tiny home. And then I can connect this into septic or a sewage system or whatever I decide on later. Then I can continue insulating the floor. Now this trailer is ready for the subfloor. So I have this 3/4 inch OSB tongue and groove subfloor paneling. And I'm using some foam construction adhesive to stick this onto the frame and limit any creaking. And screwing my sheets into the framing using these self-tapping screws. Now with the floor complete, I'm ready to start framing my walls. For this I'm using 2x4 lumber and cutting all my pieces to size according to my plan with a miter saw. I'd lay out all my boards on the ground and then nail my studs into place using 3 framing nails through the top and bottom plate. This is a pretty accelerated version of the framing process and really every aspect of this tiny home build. But I've actually already released over 7 hours of content on this tiny house that outlines every single step of the build in pretty great detail. So if you want to learn about the whole process of building this explained much more thoroughly and in a longer, less accelerated format, the links for all the individual videos of this build are in the description below. And after a couple days of work, I've got all my individual wall sections framed and ready to lift up. Below each section of wall, I just add a bit of expanding foam before we set the wall in place as an air seal. And then I'd fasten the walls to the trailer every few feet using some of these 1/2 inch stainless steel bolts and nuts. Standing the walls up, I think, was one of my favorite parts of this build, because you basically go from nothing to having a walled-in structure that you can walk around and visualize within a matter of a couple hours. After this, the monumental progress gets pretty slow, so this is a really satisfying first big step. After all the main walls are up, I just have to add these two end pieces that gets my end walls up to the proper height to support the ridge beam. And then I have these cedar 6x6s that I'm cutting up to be my 3 supporting tie beams across the middle of the structure. I screwed these onto the double top plate of the walls using these big lag bolts, and it was really windy this day. This just about cost me a camera.
Holy f***, that was close. Oh my god.
So these horizontal tie beams basically hold the walls of the structure together so that forces on the roof don't push the walls outwards. Then I cut up these shorter sections of 6x6 that'll sit on top vertically and give me some support for the ridge beam.
Oh my god.
Now it's time to put up the ridge beam, and for that I have these LVL 9.5 inch boards that'll span across my beams and be the main support piece for my roof rafters. And I laminated some of these together so it's 2 boards wide. This is probably overkill structurally for something this size, but I've never done anything like this, so I'm trying to go over the top wherever I can to make sure it's structurally sound. Now I can start sheeting my walls. For my sheeting, I'm just using some 1/2 inch standard plywood and nailing this onto the studs using some 2 3/8 inch framing nails. I had my brother help me out for the day because this is some heavy lifting and holding. We made sure to keep a 1/8 inch gap between the sheets to allow for expansion, and just using a nail as a spacer is an easy way to keep that gap. Once the house was sheeted and nailed properly, I drilled out the corners of each of the windows, and then I'm using this flush trim router bit to trim away the plywood from the window. This bit has a bearing that rides along the 2x4 framing and makes a pretty foolproof way to cut out these windows quickly. And now that's starting to look more like a house, a roofless house. Now we're gonna wrap the structure using some house wrap. This is pretty straightforward, it just wraps around the plywood and staples on. And then any vertical seams, I'd use some tuck tape to seal that up. Next I can start on the rafters. So I have this whole structure designed in some 3D software, so I spit out the dimensions of this rafter so I can cut one out and make a template. Once I had both ends and the bird's mouth cut, I can set this in place and make sure it fits. Then I can use this template to trace the cuts onto fresh 2x6s and make as many rafters as I need that are all the same. To install these rafters, I have one of these rafter hangers that I'm attaching to the ridge beam using these strong tie screws, and then connecting the rafter into that tie. And then to attach them to the wall, I'm using these truss screws that screw up through the top plate right into the rafter as a structural connection. And that makes installing these pretty quick. So next I made up these boards with these little tiny pieces of rafter. I'm not exactly sure what you would call these, but basically I'm screwing this onto the wall to continue that roof slope along this higher section of wall. And then I can nail up the fascia board. I left enough excess hanging at the ends of these fascia boards so that I can nail up these extra rafters to complete the overhang of the roof on each end. And once those final rafters are nailed up, I can trim off the excess of that fascia. And that's a structurally finished tiny house frame. We nailed up the rest of our plywood sheeting on the roof using the exact same methods. Also, it turns out I'm afraid of heights. I never really knew this, but I absolutely hated being up here on this roof.
That sucked.
But regardless, we got it done and lived to see another day. So next we need to waterproof the roof, so I have this ice and water barrier. This is a stick-down membrane that sticks right onto the plywood and is pretty much waterproof itself, though this will eventually be getting some metal roofing over top of it. Metal roofing is really the only option for a tiny house on wheels since you have to be very weight conscious. Shingles would add thousands of pounds to this build that's completely unnecessary, so even though metal's a little more expensive, it's what this house is gonna need. And now I'll be moving on to the soffit, so I have some of this tongue and groove clear cedar paneling. And before I put that up, I'm gonna run my electrical wires through here, as well as build my bird boxes at the end of the roof. Then I'm just nailing this paneling up with a 15 gauge nailer. And this tongue and groove is pretty slick because the paneling design actually covers up the fasteners once you install the next piece. Since I paid a premium for the clear cedar, which has no knots in it, it's nice to not have any exposed nail heads either. Any nails that are left exposed will be covered up by the fascia trim or the siding later on. Along the edges, I had to cut tons and tons of these little 5-inch sections and install them all one at a time. I also installed my outdoor lighting as I went along so that I could test it and make sure it was working before I moved on past. So now it's time to install my windows. There's like 15 or 16 of these, basically the same amount as like a full-size house. But that was by design. Since this is such a small space, I wanted a lot of windows and a lot of natural light to make it feel larger than it actually is. So I started off by cutting away the house wrap around the window and then flashing the bottom and sides. Then I can set the window into the opening and shim it until everything's plumb. Normally these windows would have a nailing fin around the outside, which makes it a lot easier and a lot quicker. But mine for some reason didn't come with that, so I just screw it in through the jamb. And then add a bunch of flashing on the outside to waterproof it. Wasn't ideal and it took a while. But looking at this like a year and a half later, it worked fine. So anyway, we just spent the next 2 or 3 days installing these windows and the main door. All these windows have tempered glass, which is an absolute necessity for something that moves. Don't cheap out and just get regular glass because it'll break once you tow this thing around. All these windows in the door cost something ridiculous like $16,000, but it does make for a pretty good view. So before I move on to the siding, I want to make up a couple of these cedar accent pieces. So I use my planer and table saw to cut all my pieces to size, and then screwed together this roof brace thing. This is fully aesthetic. It doesn't actually support the roof, but it looks really nice on the front of the tiny house. With a small structure like this, it's nice to add some fine details and craftsmanship to really set it over the top. And now onto the siding. For siding, I'm using this vinyl board and batten style siding. And first I have to install all my trim, so I have these corner posts that I'm installing around each of the 4 corners. These get nailed in with galvanized roofing nails. And an important thing with vinyl siding is you don't nail this fully tight, you leave a little bit of wiggle room so it can expand and contract. With those on, pretty much everything else gets trimmed out with this J-trim. This goes along the bottom, up along the roof, and around each of the windows. And I'd nail this in every foot or so. With everything trimmed out, I can start installing the siding panels. These click together and then you nail along the leading edge, and then the next piece of siding covers up those nails. This is another one of those big exterior steps that goes from unfinished to a fairly finished home within a couple days. Now before I can install all the siding, the roof has to go on. I must confess I don't really know exactly what I was doing with this part. Two of my friends are roofers, so they came and helped me out for a couple weekends. And by help me out, I mean they did all the work and I was their extra hands on the ground. Regardless of how it happened, that's a pretty nice roof. And if anybody asks, I did all the work. So now I still have that one wall to finish, and I gotta start working fast here before winter sets in. So part of this wall is actually gonna be using wood siding. So I have these clear cedar 2x4s that I cut to size. And then I countersunk some screw holes using a Forstner bit. Then I can screw these pieces into the wall. And I plug those countersunk holes with some 3/8 inch cedar dowel. Then I can start filling in between the 2x4s using some clear cedar tongue and groove. Also, I cut off the remainder of those dowels and sanded that flush, and that's a pretty nice concealed screw. Now this wood needs some protection from the elements, so I have this UV protection oil, which should allow this cedar to keep its color and not gray too much for quite a few years. I did a couple coats of that until it was a nice even finish. And I also coated the soffit in this before I had started the siding. With that cedar accent done, I can finish up the rest of the siding. Lastly, I have this black aluminum fascia covering. And this just slides up underneath the drip edge and covers up the unfinished fascia. This gets fastened in with some aluminum trim nails. And I took my time working around the tiny house, enjoying the final step of the outside. And that's the outside of my tiny house fully complete. We're about right at the end of fall right now, so I'm gonna let the worst of winter pass through and I'll start on the inside come spring. It's the beginning of March 2024, and now that most of the snow has melted, it's time to start on the interior. So right now the inside is basically just a big empty shell, so first things first, I gotta bring some lumber in here and do a little bit more framing. First off, I'm cutting up some 2x4s to make up some interior walls. I use that same framing nailer with 3 1/4 inch framing nails to stick everything together. And this is basically framing in what's going to be my bathroom, a shower, a utility closet, and the upstairs loft bedroom. Once I had all my walls framed up, I have these cedar 4x4s, and I'm just going to run these through a planer quick to give them a fresh face. Here's an example of a factory finish versus the plain finish. Just saves a lot of sanding and squares up the edges. So then I'm cutting up these 4x4s and fastening them together using some big lag screws to frame up what's going to be the loft floor. I use the cedar 4x4s for this because the framing is going to be openly visible from the bottom. I fasten the floor framing into the wall studs using a bunch of these big lag screws, and then continued framing up this full height shower. I also temporarily put some plywood down as the loft subfloor, or I should say permanently because I glued and nailed this thinking this was the permanent solution, but later had to tear it all out because I decided I would do tongue and groove cedar instead to match the rest of the ceiling. Anyway, that's the framing of the inside done. Now it's time to start on the utilities. Starting off with this black iron pipe and fittings. I bought a bunch of lengths and T's and elbows of this and fitting this together with some pipe tape and pipe compound to be my propane line. I had to get creative with my fittings to make everything fit and weave this around the tiny house. I also left this outside of the framing so that I didn't have to drill through every stud and compromise strength, and this is all going to get covered up by cabinetry anyway. The line feeds through the floor of the tiny house and will connect just into a normal 20-pound propane tank, and then feed my stove, an incinerating toilet, and a propane hot water heater. Then I can move on to electrical, so I installed my 60 amp electrical panel. And then I'll be using this 14-2 standard household wire to run this around to all my receptacles. I have a lot of friends that work in trade, so I had an electrician and a plumber come out and take a look at all this once I was done, because I don't exactly know what I'm doing and I wanted to make sure it was safe. You can get this inspected if you want, but where I live you can't actually get a moving structure inspected. So I did the next best thing, having some professionals look at it. With all my circuits tied into the panel, my final utility is water. I'll be using this 1/2-inch PEX pipe to feed my faucets and snake this around the tiny house to a hot water heater and a shower. PEX is really easy to use. You just buy the pipe and these brass fittings, and then ratchet these lock rings over top of the fittings, and it makes a perfect waterproof seal every time. After a few days of working at that, my utility rough-in is complete. Now winter decided to return for one more blast just as I'm starting to insulate this tiny house. So I'm going to be trying an unconventional way to insulate this. I have these cans of Thermcoat by Acfix, and I just want to try out a few of these to see if I could do this as a DIY spray foam method. Normally you would only use these to insulate an inch or two thick, but I'm going to try to do a couple coats and see if I can get a good 3.5 inch coverage. And my sample area has turned out fairly decent, so I'm going to try this as a cheap and easy DIY spray foam installation. I even made up this jig with a clamp and a reciprocating saw to shake these cans for me because I got 12 cases of 12 and shaking 144 cans for 30 seconds or so each gets pretty tiring on the arm. After you spray a coat, it'll expand about an inch or an inch and a half. So I did 2 coats on the walls and 3 coats on the ceiling to get this to expand to the full thickness of the lumber. The more coats I do, the more wonky and bulgy the spray foam growths would become. But I'm going to be coming back and cleaning this up with a saw afterwards. So as long as it's nice and full, I can clean the rest up anyway.
Oh, that sucks.
I used this little saw that doesn't have much surface area to clean up the bulges. I also came back with some more spray foam and filled in any gaps or cracks that were left over and got a pretty good even result in the end. Next time I'd probably just hire a spray foam company. It would suck a lot less for me. But nonetheless, this worked fine, and looking at it now, a year and a half later, it's fully thermally sufficient. One nice thing with spray foam is you don't have to do a vapor barrier, so now I'm right onto the ceiling paneling. I have some more of the 6-inch clear cedar tongue and groove. This stuff costs an arm and a leg, and you can definitely just get normal cedar or even pine, but I'm hoping the finished aesthetic of this clear cedar is worth it in the end. I nailed this stuff up with a 15 gauge nailer, nailing along the tongue so it would hide the nails as I go, and work my way around the ceiling. Like I said earlier, I also replaced that plywood on the loft so that the ceiling of the bathroom would match the rest of the ceilings. And alright, I think it was worth the money for the clear cedar. That looks pretty cool. For the wall paneling, I have this pre-primed pine 8-inch shiplap, and this stuff goes in pretty much the exact same way as I just did the ceiling. I gave each panel its first coat of paint in the shop so that all the grooves and tongues are painted correctly, and then started installing this into the tiny house. Once everything's all installed, I'll give it one more coat of paint at the end to get rid of any installation marks and freshen everything up. Now that's starting to look more like a house. Next, I need to cover up these LVL beams at the peak of the ceiling. So I have some cedar 2x8 I'm cut into size. And basically capping over top of these LVLs to make it look like a big cedar beam running through here. Then I can install all the cedar trim, and I filled the nail holes with some cedar wood filler to keep that nice, sleek, clean look. One last step on the ceiling, I have some Danish oil, and I'm going to apply this onto the cedar by brushing it on with a stain brush, and then wiping off the excess a minute or two later. This is a really foolproof finish that darkens up the color and offers a little bit of protection, but doesn't give it a glossy polyurethane look. It's still pretty natural wood. Now that's looking pretty awesome. Let's continue on with this MDF window trim. I'd cut this to size with a good miter saw and nail it into the wall with a brad nailer. I used some wood glue on the seams to stick the pieces together and work my way around each window. This only took about probably 10 minutes per window, so it was a pretty satisfying day's work. After they were all installed, I gave them one more fresh coat of trim paint, and they're good as new. Next, I can start on the floor of this main living room kitchen area. So I'm going to be installing this engineered white oak flooring with this kind of blonde amber color. I installed the floor using some glue assist and this flooring stapler. There's a lot more steps to this. I'm breezing through this to keep this video somewhat short. But like I said earlier, I've actually already released about 7 hours of content on this tiny house, outlining every step along the way in some pretty in-depth detail. The links for the individual videos are in the description below if you're interested. So now I can start on the bathroom. First things first, I'm installing that same shiplap wall paneling from the main room. And then I'm using some scrap 2x4s to build up my shower curb a little higher. I needed my shower floor to be a little bit higher to connect in the plumbing, so I used some 2x10s to build that floor up 1.5 inches. And then finished up any other framing to get the shower ready for this curdy board. This is a styrofoam board with this curdy membrane over top, which completely waterproofs the shower if done correctly. But basically you just screw it into the wall, and then this acts as the tile backer board, as well as a waterproof membrane for the shower. With all the board up, I used some of this all-set mortar as well as some curdy band to seal up any of the gaps, cracks, or screws. I also set in this angled drain pan and tied in all the plumbing. Outside of the shower, I use some more all set to stick down this tile membrane. This membrane separates the movement from the wood frame to the tile and helps prevent cracking of the tile, especially in a moving structure. This is going to help out a lot. It's also designed to accept this heating flooring cable, so I zigzag that around the bathroom floor. Now I have this natural stone tile that I'm going to stick over top of the membrane using some more all set. I also installed this shower trim, and one wall of the bathroom is done in this same marble tile. For the shower, I'm using this black porcelain tile. And after installing the drain, I'm tiling the shower floor with this black pebblestone mosaic. These mosaic tiles come glued to this 1-foot squared mesh backer, and this is a pretty small area, so that wouldn't work in here, but I just rip them off the mesh backer and install them pebble by pebble. After that, my floor and shower are ready for some grout. And a quick caulk around the edges. And that's the tile work done. So next I can basically just start installing a lot of different stuff, starting off with this shower door. Then I installed the stem and shower head. And the shower controls, and that's the shower complete. I bought these 4-panel shaker doors at Home Depot, so I'm going to install them, one to get into the bathroom and one to get into the utility closet. I bought these doors pre-hung, meaning they already have a jamb, so I'd shim that jamb level in the frame and then nail it into place using a 15-gauge nailer. And I installed some modern black hardware. Then I can nail on the trim and install any other finishing touches around the room. Like this piece of trim I had to fit around the propane line. And the transition between the hardwood and marble floor. I also had to install my heated floor thermostat and make sure everything's working.
Ooh, that's nice.
And the vanity light. For the vanity itself, I bought some cabinet grade plywood, and I'll just be making up the frames myself in my shop. Then I got some white oak to make up the doors and trim, and built this vanity over the next few days. I really had no idea what I was doing with this. I've never built cabinets before, But it actually turned out to be fairly easy. You're really just assembling a bunch of rectangles. And I wanted to do it myself because I'm going to be building all the kitchen cabinets. So this is a good dry run for that to work out any kinks on one cabinet rather than a whole kitchen's worth. Once it's in the tiny house, I can install the quartz countertop and sink, as well as the mirror. One last step for this bathroom is I need a toilet. So for a tiny house on wheels, you basically have three options. You could do an RV toilet, which would include a holding tank in the trailer that you would need to pump out pretty regularly. You could do a composting toilet, which is basically just in peat moss, and you also need to clean that out pretty regularly and deal with raw feces. Or there's these incinerating toilets. An incinerating toilet has a combustion chamber and uses propane to burn number ones and number twos, and basically just leaves behind a small amount of inert ash. There's no need for any more plumbing, all of it is burnt away. These are by far the most expensive option, but I also want this to be a nice home that doesn't require too much dealing with poo. So I didn't really see any other option than getting one of these. So this is basically like installing a big furnace in your house. You need to install all these vent pipes and make sure everything's breathing and combusting properly. Then after I've connected the toilet to propane, I can take this Cadillac for a test ride. So this pretty much works like a normal toilet with one exception. You have to add a liner before each use. This just catches all the drop-ins and makes it cleanly slide down into the combustion chamber without dirtying up the toilet every time. And I didn't think you would want to see the real deal, so we'll try it out with this O. Henry bar and some water. After that cycle completed, you can see this burnt down into pretty much nothing. And looking at this like a year later now, I can say this is a way better option than either of the other two, and you only have to empty it out like once every couple months. And it's just ash, it's not poo, it's pretty easy. Anyway, bathroom complete. Now I can move on to my loft bedroom. First things first, I need some heat and air conditioning in here, so I have this 12,000 BTU mini split, which is going to be a pretty energy efficient way to heat and cool this. At peak, this thing only uses, I think, like 1100 watts. And again, that's at peak. On average, this is probably using 400 or 500 watts to keep this warm or cool. So I installed the indoor unit between these two windows, and the outdoor unit on the tongue of the trailer, and ran the pipes in between. After it's all hooked up and tested, I can turn this on for the first time. Now on to the actual bedroom. These refrigerant pipes are now running across my loft floor, so I'm using a little bit of leftover wallboard and this piece of walnut to make up a nice little bulkhead that also kind of looks like an end table kind of deal. This case is in those pipes and gives a little bit of surface area beside the bed to set whatever on. And now I can go ahead and install in the carpet. I installed these tack strips around the edges and then some underlay. And then stretch the carpet into place. I was kind of debating just finishing that cedar tongue and groove and using that as the floor, but I realized you're kind of going to be on one knee when you're getting into bed, so the carpet is going to make that a lot more comfortable. Now I'm making up this separator wall railing accent piece with a bunch of clear cedar that separates the loft from the rest of the tiny house. I didn't want to fully seal this off with a wall, so I decided to make this slotted accent wall that kind of obstructs the view but still allows natural light to pass through and doesn't make it feel claustrophobic in the loft. So I finished this piece with some Danish oil, the same as the ceiling. And now I can take it into the loft and fasten it in place. So this tiny house was never built to stay at my dad's shop, and the day has finally come where we need to move this to its final location. So we hooked this on to my dad's F-250, and after I disconnected everything, we can get on the road. It was really weird seeing it move for the first time. It's such a large structure that I've been working on for the past year, and seeing it go down the road was unsettling. Technically this would need a wide load permit, but we're only going about 5 kilometers on country roads, so we didn't worry about it for this one. Along the trip there was also an agricultural scale, so we took it in to get it weighed, and I had no idea where this would come in, but it's sitting at just over 15,000 pounds. This is actually great for where we are in the build. We really only have cabinetry left, and I still have 5,000 pounds of available weight for this trailer's gross weight capacity. And the kitchen won't weigh anywhere near that, so we're in the clear on this one. After a stressful short journey, we arrived at the final location, all intact. So I'm parking this in my parents' backyard. I'd love to buy a lot for this thing, but honestly that doesn't really fix any problem with housing. In this area, a building lot is over $500,000, if you can even find one. So I might as well just buy a house at that point. So I'll put it in my parents' backyard and hope for the best. Can't argue with the view either. So now I need to make the stairway that goes up to my loft. And I'm going to be doing this using some cabinetry, so I have some more 3/4 inch pre-finished maple plywood. And I'm making this into a couple sturdy base cabinets. I glued together this walnut 4x4 with some scrap walnut to make my newel post. And then for the rest of the steps I had to get a little bit creative making cabinetry to make this 90-degree turn in the staircase. A quick coat of paint to match the wall color, and now I can make the treads. So I have these big 1.5 inch thick walnut slabs, and I'm going to be cutting these up with a track saw to fit inside an epoxy mold. I built these molds using MDF, and if you need a full tutorial on how to do this, you can watch the full-length video of this process in the description below. I'm basically making these treads the exact same way you would make an epoxy table, so I mixed up some opaque black epoxy and poured that into the molds. After a few days, that's cured up nice and hard, and I can demold. To surface these slabs, I'm taking them out to a local wood shop to be planed and sanded, and they come back ready to work. So I have to take a bunch of precise measurements of my staircase, and then I'll be transferring this onto the slab to cut out each individual tread. I had to buy an actual track saw for this process because I need some pretty precise cuts. Also, they're sick, you should get one if you can afford it. For some of the treads, it was easier to use these plywood strips and glue together a template. Then I can trace that onto the slab and cut out an exact fitting piece. After I routed the edges and sanded each piece to 100 grit, I'm going to be finishing up these treads with some Rubio Monocoat. This is a really easy to use oil finish. You just drizzle it on and then work it into the grain of the wood. And after it's soaked in for a few minutes, you come back with some rags and wipe off as much of the excess as you can. It's pretty foolproof. You don't have to worry about any dust settling in the finish or whatever. You can touch it right away once it's done. To install them, I'm just using a bead of construction adhesive, and that should hold these in place just fine and allow a little bit of wood movement through the seasons. And now that looks pretty awesome. Since this is such a small space, I wanted to pick a few things to really go over the top on, and this one turned out pretty cool. Next, these cabinets need drawers, so I took some precise measurements and then built these all up in the shop using some more pre-finished maple plywood and installed them on some soft close drawer slides. I built up some shaker style cabinet doors using some maple and an MDF shaker panel, and then gave them a coat of some cabinet paint in the same color as the walls. And that's a pretty nice staircase, which also has a ton of storage. I didn't want to waste any space since this is such a small house. Every nook and cranny has to be accessible. A couple finishing touches and a nice new mattress. And the loft bedroom's done. It's honestly way more spacious than you would think up here. I can pretty much stand all the way up to where I roll into bed, and I can even sit up in the bed without hitting my head. This hasn't really affected my sleep at all. If anything, it's more cozy than a normal bedroom. Now I just have to finish up the kitchen living room area. And we just got our first blast of snow for the season. This is probably my favorite shot of this entire video. Well, that snow didn't last long, but it'll be back with plenty more to come this season. For the living room, I ordered this couch from a local furniture shop that fit in the space nicely and also has this pull-out bed as an extra sleeping quarter. Now this wall is nice, but I need a good TV for this space. I bought this 65-inch Samsung frame TV that works perfectly for this space. This thing only sits probably about an inch off the wall and actually looks like a canvas. It even has its own art mode, which basically just displays different pieces of art, and it honestly looks pretty realistic. These are a good chunk more than a regular TV, but in a confined space like this, it was worth every penny. So now I'm finally onto my kitchen. I took a bunch of precise measurements of the space and then brought this into a 3D modeling program so that I can design my kitchen fairly exact. With all the cabinets designed, I picked up a bunch of lumber from a local wood supply store, and I can get cracking on these cabinets. So I'll be starting off these cabinets with some more of that 3/4 inch pre-finished maple plywood. You want to get these pre-finished sheets if you can for cabinets so that you don't have to finish the inside of every individual cabinet. Cabinets have a lot of repeatable cuts, so to make those I'm using this Craig jig and just a regular circular saw. This is basically an inverted table saw. You set the width at which you want to make your cuts. And then the side of the jig slides along the edge of the sheet and makes quick, repeatable cuts at the same width. Since all my cabinets have the same depth, this is a pretty quick way to rip all these sheets to that same dimension. And then to cut these sheets down any further, I'm just using a track saw. The front edge of each of these cabinet frames will be exposed when you open the doors. So to cover up the plywood edge, I'm using some of this maple edge banding and heating this up with an iron. And this heats up the hot glue on the back of the strip and sticks it right onto the plywood. Then I can trim that banding flush using this edge banding trimmer. That finishes up that edge, and now I'm ready to start assembling my many cabinets. So we're basically just making a bunch of rectangles here. I'd line up each of the pieces and then just tack them in place with a brad nailer. Then I'd add a few of these 2.5-inch screws to rigidly secure this frame. Most of these cabinets are going to butt together, so I don't care about the exposed screw and nail holes. In the few cases that it will be an exposed end, I'd use these pocket hole screws instead. Once I have the lower cabinet frames built, I'm painting that front edge the same color that the faces and doors are going to be. So I just applied some primer and then a couple coats of the finishing paint. Again, most of these butt together, but on the couple exposed ends I gave it a coat of primer and used my paint sprayer for the finishing coat of paint. This is a fairly entry-level sprayer, but it does a pretty nice job as long as you have a good finishing cabinet-grade paint. Now these cabinets are ready to install. I made up a little 2x4 platform for these to help level them all together, and then I started bringing in the cabinets. I screwed them together end to the walls and base plate using some 1.25-inch screws, and I worked my way around the kitchen making sure everything's plumb and level as I go. And now I can make up some drawers. My drawers are basically built the exact same way as the cabinets, except I'm using some 5/8-inch plywood to save some weight. And I spent a couple days making, I think, like 22 of these individual drawers. I installed these into the cabinets using some soft close drawer slides. And now I can bring in some appliances. So I have this apartment size fridge that fits right into the cabinet above the wheel well. And the microwave in the cabinet next to it. This 24-inch propane stove gets installed along the base cabinets. And I just had to hook into this propane line quick that we installed quite a while ago. And now we're ready to fire everything up for the first time. So I have all my base cabinets installed, and now I need to do my uppers. These are going to be a little bit different because I want these to have a walnut finish. So I have this 1/2 inch of pre-finished on one side and unfinished on the other side maple plywood. And I'm coating the unfinished side with this wood glue, and then I have this 1/4-inch sheet of walnut veneer plywood, and I'm going to glue these together to make a 3/4-inch sheet, pre-finished maple on the one side, unfinished walnut on the other. So I got everything heavy in my shop I could find to bond these sheets together overnight. And the next day, that sheet's ready to use. So I cut these up basically the exact same way I did the base cabinets, and added some walnut edge banding. A couple differences with these upper cabinets is these are only 12 inches deep versus 24 of the base cabinets. I screwed these together all with pocket holes to keep my side faces clean. I added this 1/2-inch backer piece of plywood for the cabinet backing. And I finished the walnut with some Rubio monocoat. And now these are ready to install in the tiny house. These cabinets have shelves instead of drawers, so I drilled all these shelf pin holes and made the shelves out of some scrap plywood with a piece of edge banding. And now I can measure up for the cabinet faces. So my main door frames are going to be made out of this 3/4-inch thick maple. I processed this lumber all to width with my table saw, to length with the miter saw, and then cut in this shaker profile using the router table. So now this frame will basically just slide together with some wood glue. And for my interior panel, I'll be using a sheet of MDF. And that's one down. Let's make about 35 more. After sanding everything down, these are ready for a couple coats of primer. This was my first time ever making kitchen cabinets, and I was pretty intimidated at the level of detail needed. But as I got further and further into the process, I realized you're really just building a bunch of rectangles over and over. I thought you'd need really expensive tools to be able to make these doors accurately, but I made do with some fairly entry-level stuff, and with a little bit of patience, I was able to make some pretty professional-looking cabinets. So my upper cabinet doors are made almost the exact same way as the lower cabinets, except instead of maple, I'll be using some walnut. And instead of that MDF centerpiece, I'm using some 1/4-inch walnut veneer plywood. Instead of painting these, they'll be getting some Rubio monocoat. And if you've never used this finish before, it's one of my favorites, especially for walnut. It's not like a polyurethane that coats over top and seals in the wood. You can still feel the natural grain, and the matte satin finish just looks awesome in my opinion. Then I installed the doors onto the cabinets using some soft closed door hinges, screwed in the door handles, and that really tops off the kitchen. So one thing I'm really pleasantly surprised about with this tiny house build is the amount of storage space there actually is in here. I spent a lot of time 3D modeling and working on the optimal layout to maximize space, but still be very functional and aesthetically pleasing. Every little crevice in here has been converted into a drawer or closet, and there's a pretty amazing amount of storage space in this kitchen area. So we're getting into the last few steps of this tiny house. The next thing I'm making is a desk, so I got a local woodshop to glue me together this laminated walnut panel, and I'm cutting everything to size with my track saw and gluing 2 pieces together into this waterfall edge desk. I finished that with some Rubio monocoat, and this can come into the tiny house, and I use some pocket holes to screw this directly into the cabinetry and wall. I also added this slide out to double up my desk space. With some more walnut panels, I made up these 2 end tables for the couch. And with some leftover plywood, I made this TV cabinet that matches the kitchen cabinets. So the last thing this kitchen needs is a countertop. After visiting a few places, I found this Matarazzo quartzite that fits the vibe I'm going for perfectly. And a couple weeks later, that big slab of stone was cut up and installed in my tiny house. This is a natural stone countertop that was fairly expensive, but as soon as I saw it, I knew this was going to match perfectly. And like I said before, I'm willing to go a little bit over the top on this because I've already compromised on space. And that's the last major step. We're really just into some finishing touches here. I installed my kitchen faucet and tied in the plumbing. I added these strip lights underneath the upper cabinets. And then I added this trim piece of walnut around that to cover up the direct light. A while back I added in this ceiling fan. And with some scrap wood I made up this coat rack for inside the door. On those remaining electrical boxes I added these wall-mounted lamps. And since I have so many windows, I added these blackout curtains to help with energy efficiency and just to block out the light if I want to sleep or whatever. Lastly, I ordered a couple walnut chairs for the desk and peninsula. And that's it for this tiny house. In total, this build cost just shy of 145,000 Canadian dollars. I went pretty overboard on a lot of my materials, so you could probably do it for about 30,000 less if you cut out the fancy countertops, floors, and ceilings. Depending on where you live, this might not seem like a great option, but nearly every house on this street is upwards of $1 million, so for me, this makes perfect sense. So this is the most ambitious, stressful, time-consuming, physically demanding, and yet rewarding project I've ever attempted. I had almost no experience doing any of this at the beginning, and spent many late nights researching what I had to do the next day. In the end, I'm leaving this project with not only a home built with my own two hands, but an entirely new skill set and a new outlook on life. When I first started filming this video, I had pretty much given up hope in the system. It seemed like every day it gets harder and harder to get ahead or even just survive. I really hope this video can inspire some people to make that leap, take control, and try something you never thought was possible. This project consumed me for 1.5 years of my life, and there was many days I woke up and didn't want to work on it at all. But now that it's finally done, I'm thankful for every step of the way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and leave me a comment. This goes a long way in helping channels like mine reach more and more people and make better, more ambitious content in the future. The plans for all of my builds are available for free on my website, and there's some merch there too if you're interested. It's been a long time coming, but I'm finally home.